Hi guys! It's been a while since the last video I made. That one was all about me answering FAQs about menstrual cups. I linked that video down below in the description box. This one will be all about cloth pads, but it'll be more or less a tutorial video. Since I made the switch to reusable menstrual products a few years ago, I've actually only bought a few pieces of cloth pads. Some were gifted to me, but I made most of my stash myself. Now, my sister actually gave her a sewing machine to me, but I haven't quite mastered it enough to attempt making cloth pads with them, so I resorted to making them by hand for now. I never thought that my home economics classes back in grade school and high school would come in this handy. Anyway, I'm currently 32 weeks pregnant, and I'm anticipating the need for a lot of heavy absorbency pads for the weeks that I'll still be bleeding afterwards. Really don't want to have to use those disposable adult diapers for the weeks that I'll still be bleeding. Now, my old stash of cloth pads is looking a little worn out, so I decided I wanted a fresh new set. So I took my sewing kit out and got to work. Then I realized that there may be other women out there who also want to learn how to do this themselves. So if that sounds like you, then here's a step-by-step guide on how to make your own cloth pads by hand. Here's a tip: if you know how to use a sewing machine, use it and save a ton of time.
To make your pads, you're going to need these materials. First up is fabric. You'll need something to use as a topper. This is the topmost layer that first absorbs the blood or discharge. You'll want to use a material that doesn't stain easily and that wicks moisture away from your skin for a stay dry feeling. I use athletic wicking jersey or AWJ for those reasons. Others use cotton, which stains easily, or flannel, which also stains easily and which I find shows obvious wear and tear after a while. There are a lot of other options for this which you can find online. Next thing you're going to need is fabric for soakers. That's the layer that's going to go inside the pad. This is composed of one or more layers of absorbent fabric that will draw the blood away from the topper. Some use only one type of fabric while others use a mixture. There are a lot of options for this. I have tried using fabric from those cheap Good Morning towels, which can get bulky and are difficult to sew. Now, I personally use old flour sacks for this. My mom swears by the absorbency of flour sacks, since that's what a lot of people used back then as cloth diapers. She was right. I find that they work really well. They're quite thin, but very absorbent. They're also easy to find and are dirt cheap. Next, you need your waterproof layer. I use PUL or polyurethane laminate, which is a laminated layer of fabric that is thin and still quite breathable while being waterproof. Now you will notice that one side of this fabric is shiny, and that would be the laminated side. I don't think it's showing on camera, but anyway, this is really good material. Then you need your backer. This is where you can have some fun with the print. You can pretty much use any fabric that you want for this, except for anything too smooth or shiny, because then the pad will slide around in your underwear. I usually opt for woven cotton for my backers. Then, of course, you'll need an assortment of colors for your thread, and you need closure materials. I personally use snaps. You can find a lot of suppliers for this online. I got these on Shopee. But if you use snaps, then you're going to need snap pliers to go with it. Of course, if you don't want to go out and buy snap pliers and snaps, you can always use buttons. For my earlier DIY pads, I used buttons to close them, and they worked just fine. They just take a couple more seconds to close. Then you're gonna need needles and fabric scissors. I just bought these regular scissors. They're not actual fabric shears, but use scissors that are not used for anything other than fabric. Trust me, this will make your life easier. It also helps keep your scissors to stay sharp. The first step is to create and choose your desired pattern and trace it onto a piece of cardboard or plastic folder. something that's stiffer than regular paper so that you don't have to worry about it tearing. I traced mine off of another pad that I have and just made a few tweaks to the dimensions. You'll need one pattern for the soakers and another pattern for the topper, backer, and waterproof layer. So these are the patterns that I've made for my liners and regular pads. Now, these are for most of the pad and these are for the soakers. Now, since I'm currently making postpartum or overnight pads, these are the patterns that I'll be using. Now, this is for the soaker and this is for the topper, backer, and waterproof layer. So you're going to trace your patterns on your fabric of choice and cut them out with fabric scissors. You can have as many layers for your soakers as you want, depending on the amount of absorbency that you're going to need. Now put the soaker layers together, secure the edges with pins, and then sew them together. You can use a simpler running stitch or back stitch for this, but I prefer to use a blanket stitch just because it looks a lot neater. Okay, so the next step is to secure the soaker to the underside of your topper, which I've already done here. I use a simple back stitch for this just because it looks neater and is more secure, but you can definitely do a running stitch for this as well. Now I suggest placing the stitches about 1.5 centimeters from the edge. Now some makers want to do this a lot quicker, so they just do a running stitch down the middle of the pad. But I don't like to do that because then you'll have to keep fixing the size of the soaker every time you wash the pad. So I prefer to do this type of stitching all around. Now this next part is where it gets a little tricky. You're going to start attaching the PUL or whatever waterproof layer you're using and the backer to the previous 2 layers. Keep in mind that when the pad is done, you'll want the shiny side of the PUL facing up towards the topper, and the printed or prettier side of the backer facing down towards where your underwear would be. But since we'll be turning the pad inside out at the end of this step, you have to pin the layers so that the patterned or printed side of the backer is facing the topper. This will be followed by the non-laminated side of the PUL. Now this may sound a little confusing, but after this step, we're going to turn it inside out so everything is going to be facing in the right direction. It'll make sense later, I promise. Once we turn the pad right side out, everything should be in its proper place. But for now, we need to secure this with pins. If your topper is rather stretchy, like AWJ, you'll want to use more pins since it has a tendency to move around or bunch up more. Next, we stitch them together. Start your stitches in a straighter portion, somewhere in the middle of the pattern rather than on a curve. That will make turning the pad out and closing the gap a lot easier. You're going to run back stitches around the soaker, a few millimeters from the soaker edge. Don't get it too close to the edge because then you're going to end up with a very lumpy pad. When you get to the wing section, don't sew right through to the other side. Instead, sew along the edge of the wings. Stop and leave a gap about 1.5 inches from where you started, and that will be your turn hole. Okay, so this is what it looks like now after stitching. There's my turn hole. I unfortunately made my turn hole a little too small, I think, but we can make it work. Now what we have to do next is cut out triangular shapes from the edges of the fabric outside the stitches. This is so important because if you don't do it, The edges of your pad will be all lumpy once you turn it out. I've forgotten to do this step before, and I had to turn the pad inside out again to fix it. So don't skip this step. Also, make sure that you don't accidentally snip the stitches, otherwise your pad will come apart after several washes. Get close, but be very careful. So this is what your pad should look like at this point. Now we're ready to turn the pad out carefully through the turn hole. Now you can see that the edges aren't completely turned out. So what you can do to fix that is to stick something long, like a marker, or in this case, a hole puncher, into the turn hole and gently push the edges out. Now some pad makers would go over the pad with a hot iron at this point just to flatten it out, but I don't usually do that. I just sort of flatten it like this with my hands. Now we can close off the turn hole. I use a blanket stitch for this and run the stitches all around the entire pad to flatten and secure the edges. I usually stick really close to the edge because if you make the stitches too big, then you'll punch holes in the waterproof layer and you'll end up with leaks. So stick closer to the edges. So we're done with that, and this is what the edges should look like, with the blanket stitch running all around the pad. All you have to do now is apply your closure mechanism of choice. Since I already have snaps and snap pliers, I'm going to go with those. Snaps are just a lot easier to close compared to buttons. But again, if you don't have snap pliers yet, you can always go with buttons and they'll work just fine. And you're done. You now have a fully functional cloth pad.
So there you go. Please keep in mind that this is just how I personally like to make my cloth pads. There are a lot of other more experienced pad makers out there that probably do some of these things a little differently than I do. So I recommend that you check out their video tutorials as well. I'll link a couple of helpful videos down in the description box below. Also, if you're curious about where I got my materials, if you check out my blog All Scrubbed Out, I have some links there to my local suppliers. Oh, I almost forgot. Make sure you pre-wash all your fabric before you start cutting out the patterns. This is so that if the fabric shrinks, you won't end up with wonky or crooked pads in the end. And apparently, pre-washing is also supposed to increase the absorbency of your pads, sort of prime them somehow. Don't ask me how it does that, because I just learned that from other more experienced pad makers and I took their word for it. I'm no expert. Anyway, I hope this video was helpful for you, and I hope it encourages more women to make the switch to reusable menstrual products. It truly is the better option both for ourselves and for the environment. Take care and thanks for watching.